Marjorie had always appreciated quiet mornings. Since retiring from teaching history at the local high school, her days followed a gentle rhythm. Tea at 7 o'clock in the morning, gardening until 10, a crossword puzzle before lunch, and a good book in the afternoon. Her small house in the outskirts of Kennett Square, Pennsylvania, had become her sanctuary. Surrounded by a garden that bloomed brighter each spring, it was a place of peace and routine. Two things she had come to cherish. That morning had started like any other. Clara, her daughter-in-law, had arrived early to help with the flower beds. They were preparing for a local garden tour, and Clara had always shown a keen interest in Marjorie's gardening methods. The two women worked side by side, laughing softly about the stubborn tulips that refused to bloom near the fence. By 10 o'clock, they were back inside, sipping tea at the kitchen table, their hands still smelling faintly of soil and lavender. When the phone rang, Marjorie glanced at the screen and smiled. "It's Kevin," she said, tapping the green icon and lifting the phone to her ear. Her son rarely called during the day. He was a commercial pilot, constantly on the move, one day in Denver, the next in Rome. Marjorie had grown used to brief updates and voicemail messages. "Hi, sweetheart," she answered cheerfully. Kevin's voice came through, but it was taut, uneasy. "Mom, is Clara with you?" The question made her pause. "Yes," she said slowly, glancing at the hallway. "She's here." "Why?" There was silence on the line. Not static, not a drop signal. Just a moment of complete, unexpected quiet. "Are you sure?" Kevin asked, his tone softer now, as if weighing every syllable. Marjorie frowned. "She's been here all morning. We were just in the garden together. Why are you asking?" Kevin exhaled sharply, a sound not quite like relief. "Because someone who looks exactly like Clara just boarded my flight to Paris. Same build, same hair, same bag, even the same scarf. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. Just walked past me and sat in first class." Marjorie sat straighter in her chair. "You must be mistaken. She was just..." She stood, her mind racing. Clara hadn't said anything about a trip. They had planned to spend the day together. She had even left her purse by the door, hadn't she? Kevin's voice brought her back. Could it be someone who looks like her? A coincidence? "Maybe," Marjorie replied, though doubt was beginning to creep in. "Let me just check. Hang on a moment." She set the phone on speaker and called out, "Clara?" No answer. She walked to the hallway and repeated the name louder. Still nothing. A strange flutter began in her chest, the kind of uncertainty that only widens when met with silence. "Clara?" she called again, walking briskly toward the guest room. The door was slightly ajar. The bed was made. The window was open just enough to let in the morning breeze, fluttering the sheer white curtains. Clara's light jacket was still draped over the chair by the door. Her cup of tea sat half full on the nightstand. Marjorie returned to the kitchen. "She's not here," she said, more to herself than to Kevin. "That's strange. She didn't say anything about leaving." Kevin's voice, still on speaker, was filled with concern. "She didn't say a word when she left?" "I didn't even know she had," Marjorie admitted. "She left her phone here," Kevin said suddenly. "Can you check?" Marjorie turned and spotted the device near the charging station beside the fridge. It was still plugged in. "Yes, it's here," she confirmed. Kevin let out a low groan. "Okay, this is odd. Look, I have to finish boarding. But can you please try to find out what's going on? I'll be in the air for the next 7 hours. As soon as I land, I'll call again." "Of course," Marjorie replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Don't worry, we'll sort it out." The line clicked off. She stood in the kitchen, staring at the phone, trying to stitch together the morning in her mind. Clara had been there, laughing, digging through the garden soil, asking about the lilies. Had she left while Marjorie was showering? Or stepped out while she was putting the tools away? The doorbell hadn't rung. No one had come to pick her up. And her things, her personal things, were all still here. Marjorie walked slowly to the back door. It was unlocked, the latch resting loosely against the frame. She stepped outside. The air was cooler than usual for early autumn. Leaves scattered across the patio in lazy spirals. No sign of Clara. She returned inside and sat down, breathing carefully. It could be nothing. Clara might have gone for a short walk. Or maybe someone had made a mistake at the airport. Surely Kevin had only seen someone who looked like her. That had to be it. But then why had she not said goodbye? Why would she leave her phone? Why hadn't she answered when Marjorie called? She reached for the teacup Clara had left behind and held it between her hands, still faintly warm. Something didn't feel right. Not at all. Marjorie stood in the middle of her kitchen, the stillness around her beginning to feel heavier than the calm she was used to. The house, usually filled with the faint hum of a radio or the soft sounds of birds through open windows, now seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind outside had stilled, as if waiting for her to make sense of what had just happened. She moved through the hallway with slow, deliberate steps, her eyes scanning for any sign that Clara might still be nearby. The guest bathroom door was open. The laundry room was empty. Clara's jacket still hung over the same chair, and her gardening gloves lay on the counter near the sink. Everything was in place, except Clara. A sudden sharp bark echoed from next door, her neighbor's dog, pulling Marjorie from her thoughts. She walked to the front window and glanced outside. The street was quiet. Only a single delivery truck a few houses down and an older couple walking hand in hand along the sidewalk. No sign of Clara and no visitors. She returned to the kitchen and sat down, her fingers grazing the edge of the table as if searching for something to anchor her thoughts. The phone remained beside her, lifeless now after Kevin's call. 7 hours until he would be reachable again. 7 hours with nothing but questions. Rising again, she walked into the living room and checked the coat rack near the front door. Clara's handbag was missing. Marjorie blinked. That hadn't occurred to her earlier. The purse had been there when they had come in from the garden. She remembered Clara placing it on the hook, laughing about how she always brought too many things when visiting for just a day. So she had taken it with her, but left her phone? That detail caught Marjorie off guard. She tried to imagine a reason someone would walk off with their bag, but not their phone. Clara wasn't careless. She was organized, thoughtful, attentive to routine. This wasn't like her. Then, another thought struck. Perhaps she had planned to leave and simply didn't want to disturb the morning. But that didn't explain why Kevin believed she was in Paris. Why had a woman so unmistakably similar to Clara boarded that flight? The puzzle deepened. Marjorie walked to the guest bedroom once more, scanning the space with fresh eyes. She noticed a small notepad on the nightstand. Tearing off the top page, she examined the note again. Back soon. Just needed a breather. See. She brought it closer to the light and frowned. Something was undeniably off. Clara's handwriting had a distinct style. Rounded letters, careful spacing, a neatness that reflected her personality. This note, though brief, bore a different rhythm. The loops were tighter, the slant more exaggerated. Marjorie wasn't an expert, but decades of grading student essays had taught her to notice subtle differences in penmanship. She took the note into her office, pulled open a drawer, and retrieved a card Clara had sent her last Christmas. Holding the two side by side, the contrast became clearer. This wasn't written by the same hand. She leaned back in her chair, the weight of that realization pressing on her. Why would someone impersonate Clara? And more curiously, who would have access to her things and the confidence to write such a note? Marjorie tapped the table gently, thinking. Elena. The name came back with unexpected clarity. Clara's cousin, the one Kevin had mentioned during a family dinner last summer. They had grown up together, more like sisters and cousins. Marjorie remembered that Elena bore a strong resemblance to Clara. Same dark hair, same slender frame. They had even joked once that the two could switch places and fool people. Had that been more than a joke? She pulled out her laptop and opened her email. A quick search revealed a message from Elena just a few days prior. A thank you note for the birthday card Marjorie had sent. The signature matched the C in the note suspiciously well. Her breath caught. Had Elena visited the house this morning? Was that even possible? She checked the kitchen calendar. No mention of a visit, but that wouldn't be unusual. Clara might have invited Elena on a whim, Or perhaps Elena had decided to surprise them both. Marjorie stood and returned to the guest bedroom. Checking the closet, there were no extra belongings, no signs of second visitor. But if someone had come and gone quickly, just long enough to borrow Clara's bag and walk out, it might leave no trace. The idea seemed far-fetched, yet something about it tugged at her intuition. She walked outside the mailbox and opened the small metal door. Inside, a single postcard sat atop a stack of advertisements and envelopes. She pulled it out and turned it over. The front showed a photo of the Eiffel Tower. The back, in hurried handwriting, read, "In case you hear from anyone, don't worry. It's not what it seems. Talk soon. E." Marjorie stared at the card. E. It couldn't be a coincidence. She walked slowly back to the house, her mind racing now. A cousin who looked like Clara, a cryptic note, a postcard from Paris, and a missing woman who may not be missing at all. Once inside, she went to the side table where Clara had left her phone. Marjorie hesitated only a moment before picking it up. It was unlocked. Clara rarely used passwords. She believed if someone wanted her recipes or garden photos that badly, they were welcome to them. Marjorie opened the recent messages. Most were mundane. Chats with friends, messages from Kevin, photos of garden layouts. But one message stood out. Received just yesterday from a contact saved as E. You sure this will work? I haven't seen you in years. And suddenly it's like I'm looking in a mirror. No reply from Clara. Just the one message. Marjorie's pulse quickened. She sat down at the kitchen table again, piecing together what she now suspected. Elena had come to the house. For what reason, she couldn't yet know. Somehow, she had ended up with Clara's bag and boarded Kevin's flight to Paris. Clara, meanwhile, had stepped out, possibly unaware of what had transpired. But that left one lingering, troubling question. Where was Clara now? And why had she left no explanation? The house, once again, fell into silence. A silence that no longer felt peaceful. It felt like the space just before a truth was revealed. A truth that no one was quite ready to face. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway became impossibly loud as Marjorie sat motionless at the kitchen table, Clara's phone still in her hand. She had not planned to play detective that day, and certainly not with someone she trusted so deeply. Yet everything around her pointed to something strange, something layered beneath the ordinary. She stood and returned the phone to the charging station, her mind racing. The postcard from Paris, the handwriting that was not Clara's, the message from someone signed only E. None of it added up, not completely. Clara was no longer in the house. Elena was somehow in Paris, carrying Clara's bag. But how did one slip into the life of another so easily? And more urgently, why? The most pressing question remained unanswered. Where was Clara now? Marjorie walked to the hallway, opened the closet, and reached for her raincoat. The sky outside had grown overcast, as if in sympathy with her unease. She locked the front door behind her and stepped into the early afternoon air, the scent of moist soil rising from the garden beds. She made her way toward the sidewalk, not sure where she was headed until her feet took her down the narrow street that led to the park at the edge of town. It was a place Clara often mentioned. She liked to walk there when she needed space to think, to clear her head. If she had truly stepped out just for a breather, as the note claimed, perhaps she had gone there. Perhaps she would be sitting on the bench under the large oak tree, staring at the pond the way she used to when her mother was ill. Marjorie moved with purpose, her pace quicker than usual. Her eyes scanned each corner of the quiet residential street, searching for any trace of her daughter-in-law. She turned left at the old post office, crossed the street in front of the bakery, and stepped onto the gravel path that led into the park. There was no one on the benches near the entrance. A young mother pushed a stroller down one path, and a jogger passed by, nodding politely. But no sign of Clara. Marjorie walked farther, toward the pond. The oak tree stood just as she remembered, wide-branched and heavy with leaves that whispered faintly in the breeze. She approached the wooden bench beneath it and sat down slowly. She waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Still no Clara. Reaching into her coat pocket, she pulled out the note again. The one signed with a C, That didn't look like Clara's writing. She read it one more time, then folded it back into her pocket. Her eyes lifted to the sky, which had begun to darken further. Clouds gathering above the tree line. Rain was coming. She stood and turned back toward home. As she passed a trash bin near the pond, something caught her eye, a torn piece of floral paper, the kind used in personal stationery. Something about the pattern seemed familiar. She pulled it from the edge of the bin, careful not to touch anything else. The paper was damp and wrinkled, but legible. A half-written note in the same unfamiliar handwriting read, "Tell her before." Then it trailed off, the rest of the sentence torn away. Her heart quickened. She folded the fragment and placed it into a separate pocket. The walk back to the house was brisk, and by the time she arrived, the first drops of rain had begun to fall. Inside, she removed her coat, hung it on the hook, and sat down in the living room, this time with her own notebook. She began listing everything she knew. Clara was with her that morning. At some point, she left quietly. Her bag is gone. Her phone is still here. A note was left in handwriting that does not match Clara's. Elena, her cousin, strongly resembles her. Kevin believes he saw Clara boarding his flight to Paris. A postcard from Paris arrived the same day. A new message from E appeared on Clara's phone. A torn note was found in the park. She tapped the pen on the page, staring at the list. A pattern was forming, but its shape was still indistinct. She needed more information, something tangible, something current. The idea came without hesitation. She picked up Clara's phone again, opened the contact list, and searched for Elena. No number. Curious, she returned the Messages app and reopened the message from E. It had no number or contact photo, just a letter. She tapped the message and selected the option to call. It rang once, then twice. On the third ring, someone picked up. There was silence on the other end. Not background noise, not the hum of movement, just silence, as though someone had answered and held the phone without speaking. "Hello," Marjorie said cautiously. "Elena?" A breath, soft, sharp, then a voice. I didn't think anyone would call. It was unmistakably female, young but tired. "Elena?" Marjorie repeated. A pause. "Yes," the voice said finally, "but I can't talk right now." "Wait," Marjorie pressed. "Is Clara with you? Do you know where she is?" Another breath, this time more audible. "She's safe," Elena replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't mean for it to get this complicated." "Then help me understand it," Marjorie said, leaning forward. "Because from where I stand, my daughter-in-law has vanished, and you are in Paris with her belongings." "I didn't take her things," Elena said quickly. "She gave me the bag. I was only supposed to fill in for a few hours, but then something changed." "What changed?" "I have to go," Elena whispered. "She'll explain everything when she's ready. Just trust her." The line went dead. Marjorie stared at the screen. The woman hadn't sounded panicked, but there was something behind her words. Guilt, perhaps, or fear. She had said Clara was safe, but not where. She had implied that Clara had willingly given her the bag. But why? Marjorie reached for her landline and dialed the hotel where Elena had been staying. The woman at the front desk was polite but firm. Elena had checked out that morning and left no forwarding information. She hung up and turned back toward the kitchen, her thoughts now turning toward Kevin. He wouldn't land in Paris for another few hours. Should she tell him what she had found? Or wait, gather more? The silence returned the house as the rain began in earnest, tapping gently against the windows. Marjorie sat still for a moment, her hands folded in her lap. One person had the answers. And wherever Clara was now, she had left more than a mystery behind. She had left a trail, and Marjorie intended to follow it. Marjorie spent the rest of the afternoon pacing the rooms of her house, her mind a web of loose ends and half-formed theories. The conversation with Elena had brought no clarity, only more layers of ambiguity. Clara had apparently consented to something, perhaps even initiated it, but the why remained elusive, and the phrase "fill in for a few hours" struck Marjorie like a riddle wrapped in code. What exactly had Elena been pretending to do? As the rain outside grew heavier, she retreated to her office, the one room in the house untouched by the morning's unease. A small desk lamp cast a warm glow over papers, letters, and photographs. The photo album sat on the lower shelf, arranged neatly by year. Marjorie reached for one marked family, 2003 to 2008, and opened it to a random page. There, among the summer picnics and holiday snapshots, was a photo of Clara and Elena at age 12, side by side on a porch swing, both wearing the same yellow sundress. They had matching braids, identical smiles, and almost eerie symmetry. Looking at the photo now, it was clear how easily one could have been mistaken for the other. Still, a mother-in-law's, I always noticed what others missed. Clara had a particular tension in her eyes when she smiled, a glimmer of thought always present behind her expression. Elena's smile, in contrast, was more performative, charming, yes, but more like a practiced shape than a natural state. Marjorie leaned back in her chair, letting her thoughts drift. Why had Clara not told her she was planning anything unusual? If the trip to the park had been a cover for something more elaborate, what was the goal? And what role did Elena truly play in it? She pulled out the piece of torn paper, found near the pond. Tell her before, it gnawed at her. Tell who? Tell what? Was Clara trying to confess something to Marjorie, or had the message been meant for Elena? She walked to the bookshelf and retrieved her reading glasses, then returned to the table and examined the note under the light. The pen stroke was thick, almost rushed, as if written quickly and perhaps under pressure. And the paper, it was from the same stationery set she had given Clara 2 Christmases ago. Pale floral border, soft linen finish. No doubt about it, which meant Clara had likely written this herself. But then why tear up and throw it away? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the mail slot in the front door clicking open. Surprised by a second delivery, she walked to the entryway and retrieved a single envelope from the floor. No postage. Hand-delivered. The envelope was addressed to her in neat script. She opened it slowly. Inside was a folded page and a photograph. The photo showed a woman standing in front of a mural, vivid, painted wings stretching behind her. The woman wore sunglasses, her hair pulled back, a scarf wrapped loosely around her neck. But it wasn't Clara. Not quite. Elena. The caption on the back, written in the same hand as the envelope, read, "In case you were wondering, we never planned to lie, just needed space." The note inside was brief. Marjorie, she needed time. That's all. No danger, no trouble. Just distance. Please trust that. E. Marjorie sat on the edge of the couch, the letter resting in her lap. No danger, no trouble. But why all the secrecy, the layers, the charade at the airport? The pieces of the puzzle were there, but they refused to settle into place. She decided to call someone who might know more, or at least offer a perspective she hadn't considered. After scrolling through her contacts, she dialed the number of Clara's longtime friend, Julia. The two had been close since college, and though they spoke less often in recent years, Julia remained a constant presence on birthdays and holidays. Julia speaking. "Hi, it's Marjorie. I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Julia replied warmly. "Is everything okay?" Marjorie hesitated. "I need to ask you something. It's about Clara." "Of course. What's going on?" "She's gone," Marjorie said slowly. "Not missing, exactly, but she left without a word. And I just found out she may have asked Elena to pretend to be her, to board a flight. Kevin thinks she flew to Paris. But it was Elena. Clara's somewhere else, and I don't know why." There was silence on the other end, and then a soft sigh. "I wondered if she'd do something like this," Julia said. Marjorie blinked. "You did?" "Last time we spoke, she mentioned feeling overwhelmed." Julia said gently, "Not with Kevin, not with anything dramatic. Just tired, like she'd lost herself in everything. She said Elena had reached out after years, and that they were talking again." "Did she say anything about leaving?" "Not directly, but she did say, 'Sometimes I wish I could disappear for a while without anyone worrying.' And you didn't think to mention that to anyone?" Marjorie asked, trying to keep the edge from her voice. "She didn't sound unstable, Marjorie," Julia replied calmly. She just sounded like someone who needed a breath. I assumed it was just talk. I didn't think she'd act on it. Marjorie nodded, more to herself than to Julia. Thank you. That helps more than you know. After ending the call, she sat in silence once more, the letter and photo now placed beside the torn note on the coffee table. They painted a picture, not a crisis, but of quiet unraveling. Clara hadn't been trying to disappear from her family. She'd been trying to find herself again. Perhaps Elena, with her shared past and striking resemblance, had offered the one loophole through which Clara could slip without leaving destruction behind. Still, it felt too neat, too clean. What was Clara doing now, wherever she was? And why had she involved Marjorie, even indirectly, in the deception? As evening settled in, Marjorie brewed another cup of tea and returned to the kitchen. She sat near the window, watching as the light faded into gray. The house was quiet again, but this time the silence wasn't heavy. It was full of movement beneath the surface. Secrets just beginning to surface. Truths waiting patiently for their moment. A knock came at the door. She stood and walked to it. Opening it slowly, a man stood there, soaked from the rain. Tall, lean, glasses fogged. "Mrs. Langford?" he asked. "Yes." "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said, removing his cap. "My name is Samuel. I work at the town library. I think I may have something of Clara's. She left it in one of the study rooms last week." He held out a notebook. Marjorie took it carefully. "Thank you. That's very kind of you." "I wasn't sure where to bring it," Samuel said, glancing at the porch light. "But your name was inside the front cover." When he was gone, Marjorie closed the door and sat back down. She opened the notebook. Inside were sketches, notes, and quotes. Pages of reflective writing in Clara's hand. And on the second page, "Maybe the only way to understand yourself is to step outside the roles you spent your life perfecting. Not forever, just long enough to breathe." Marjorie closed the notebook slowly, her hand still resting on it. Now she understood. Not everything, but enough. Night settled slowly over Kennett Square, the rain finally tapering off into a fine mist that clung to the windows like dew. Marjorie sat by the fireplace, the soft crackling of the logs the only sound in the room. On the table beside her lay the notebook recovered from the library, now open to the middle, where Clara's handwriting filled the pages in steady, looping lines. The entries were not dated, but the order felt recent. There were reflections on daily life, some personal sketches, and fragments of thoughts that danced between clarity and doubt. One page in particular had captured Marjorie's attention. It read, "What if the person you used to be is still there? Just quiet, waiting behind the noise of your name, your routines, your polite smiles. What if Elena is a mirror, not to escape into, but to remember through?" Marjorie had reread that page 5 times. The mirror metaphor echoed something Julia had said. Clara wasn't running away. She was trying to step outside herself long enough to see who she really was. Elena, with her resemblance and shared history, had become the perfect stand-in. But the more Marjorie read, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a sudden decision. Clara had been building toward it quietly for a long time. She turned another page. "Sometimes I feel like the version of myself that people see as a role I agreed to so long ago. I forgot I could say no. And then I look at old pictures, hear old songs, and it hits me. I haven't had a conversation with that girl in years." Marjorie's eyes lingered on that line. That girl. Clara had once been a spirited, artistic young woman, full of color and contradiction. Over the years, she had grown into her roles: wife, daughter-in-law, career professional. Reliable, graceful, composed. And yet, underneath, there had been another rhythm, quieter but insistent. Marjorie stood, carrying the notebook to her study. She placed it on her desk beside the letter from Elena and the torn note found at the park. Pieces of Clara, scattered in different forms. A part of her wanted to call Kevin, to let him know everything she had discovered. But he was still in the air. And besides, this wasn't something that could be explained in a message or a quick phone call. It wasn't a crisis. It was something softer, more internal, a shift in identity rather than location. Still, Marjorie needed more. She returned to the kitchen and reached for the house phone. This time, She dialed Clara's office. The number rang twice before an automated message played, cheerful and professional. "You've reached Clara Langford at Birch and Myers Consulting. I'm currently out of the office, but please leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as possible." Marjorie didn't leave a message. Instead, she searched through her contacts until she found the number for Linda Myers, the senior partner Clara often spoke of. They had met a few times at functions and had shared polite conversations about Clara's work ethic and dedication. "Hello." Linda's voice answered. "Linda, this is Marjorie Langford. I hope I'm not calling too late." "Not at all," she replied. "Is everything all right?" "I'm trying to reach Clara," Marjorie said. "She's not answering her phone, and I understand she's taken a bit of unexpected time off." Linda paused. "Yes. She mentioned needing a few days. Personal time. Said she had something important to reconnect with. Is she okay?" "I believe she is," Marjorie replied cautiously. "Do you know when she left the office?" "Let me think. It was last Friday. She cleared her calendar through the end of next week. That's all I know. Friday. That was 3 days ago. Long enough for someone to fly to Paris and return, but too short for a major vacation. Clara hadn't mentioned any of this to Marjorie beforehand. That in itself wasn't suspicious. Adults often made decisions independently. But the secrecy now felt intentional. After thanking Linda and ending the call, Marjorie stood quietly in the kitchen. Then, without overthinking it, she returned to the guest bedroom and opened the closet. Most of Clara's things were still there. Her change of clothes, her scarf, a pair of reading glasses. But one item drew Marjorie's attention. A small, worn shoebox tucked in the back corner. She pulled it out gently and carried it to the bed. Inside were old photographs, folded letters, and a few small objects. A charm bracelet, a faded playbill from a college induction, a dried flower pressed into a book page. It was Clara's memory box. Marjorie had never seen it before. She unfolded one of the letters. The handwriting was unmistakably young, uneven, written in purple ink. "Dear Elena, we should switch places sometime, just to see what happens. I bet no one would even notice. Love, see." She opened another envelope. It contained a snapshot of the two cousins at age 16, standing in front of a mirror at a thrift store, both wearing vintage hats and matching lipstick. On the back, guess which one's me? Marjorie smiled faintly. The game had started long ago, playful at first, just cousins having fun. But now that childhood fantasy had become a reality, one crafted with adult intentions and consequences. She kept digging. At the bottom of the box, beneath a sheet of tissue paper, lay a small, bound journal. Marjorie hesitated, then opened it. The first page held a single line. "This is not a diary. This is a map back to me." She read slowly, page after page. Each entry built upon the last. A breadcrumb trail of inner tension, longing, and eventually resolve. Clara had been planning a brief disappearance not to escape from her life, but to reclaim it. She had written of feeling invisible in her routines, worn down by expectations, unsure when she had last made a choice that was truly her own. Elena had entered the picture at the perfect time, unattached, recently relocated, and willing to help. Clara had orchestrated everything. Elena's visit, the borrowed bag, the plane ticket, even the note Marjorie had found on the counter. But she had not intended to stay away long. It was all meant to be temporary. A mirror held up to herself, a reflection from which she could return. Marjorie closed the journal and placed it gently back in the box. A memory rose to the surface. Clara standing in the kitchen years ago, laughing over a recipe gone wrong, her hair tied back in a messy bun, no makeup, no plan, just presence. That version of her had seemed so alive, and maybe that was a version she missed. Marjorie stood and looked out the window again. The mist was lifting. A soft light touched the horizon, the first sign of dawn. There was still no word from Clara, no confirmation of her exact whereabouts. But for the first time since that strange phone call with Kevin, Marjorie felt something close to peace. Clara wasn't lost. She was remembering, and the memories she was collecting, whatever they were, would guide her home, not to the same version of herself, perhaps, but to someone truer, someone ready to return, not out of obligation, but from choice. By the time the first rays of morning lit the kitchen walls, Marjorie had not slept. Her mind, though weary, remained sharp, sorting the trail Clara had left behind. The shoebox full of memories now sat closed on the desk, but its contents had reshaped everything Marjorie thought she understood. Clara hadn't vanished. She had repositioned herself, and with Elena's help, had stepped temporarily out of her own life. But questions remained, too many to ignore. Why had Clara needed Elena's presence so specifically? Why a trip to Paris, of all places? And how much of this had been spontaneous? And how much was orchestrated? Marjorie poured herself a second cup of tea and sat at the breakfast table. Outside, the town stirred slowly to life. A school bus passed by. A neighbor's dog barked at the mail carrier. It was a kind of morning Clara would have enjoyed, wrapped in a cardigan, feet tucked beneath her on the armchair by the window, sipping coffee while skimming through the newspaper. But today, the chair was empty and the newspaper untouched. She glanced at the envelope Elena had hand-delivered, the photo, the letter, all hints, gentle nudges toward understanding. But now, Marjorie needed something more concrete, something practical. She returned to the guest room and picked up Clara's phone again. There were still no new messages or calls, but one thing had been overlooked. She opened the map app. Recent searches. The list was short. Clara didn't use her phone much for directions, but one name jumped out immediately. Whistling Pines Retreat, Fairhill. Marjorie paused. Fairhill was a small town just 30 minutes south, barely more than a cluster of antique stores and hiking trails. She had never heard of Whistling Pines, but the name sounded like a private lodge or spiritual retreat. She searched it online and found a modest website. Soft earth tones, photos of wooded cabins, descriptions of meditation classes and artist residencies. One section stood out. Rediscover your voice. Reconnect with yourself. Weekly stays available for creative renewal, healing, and personal quiet. Below that, a list of names. Marjorie scanned until she found it. Current guests, E. Langford Residency. C. Langford Visitor. So they were there, together, not in Paris. Marjorie stared at the screen. Kevin had seen Elena board the flight, and Clara had left her phone behind. Intentionally, no doubt, to allow the illusion to carry through. But the real story was unfolding much closer to home. Marjorie didn't call. She didn't want to risk breaking the moment Clara had carved out for herself. But she needed to speak to someone who could help her understand it better. Someone who could offer perspective, not just on Clara, but on Elena. She retrieved a small notepad from her office drawer and flipped through names until she found what she was looking for. Elena's mother, Susan. They hadn't spoken in years, but there had never been any ill will, just time and distance. She dialed. It rang 5 times before Susan's voice answered, groggy but polite. Hello? Susan, it's Marjorie Langford. I'm sorry to call so early. A pause. Marjorie. My goodness. It's been, over a decade? Yes, Marjorie said softly. I need to talk to you. About Clara and Elena. Susan's tone shifted immediately. You found them? I know where they are. They're safe. But I need to understand why they're doing this. Why Clara would ask Elena to take her place, even temporarily. Has anything happened with Elena recently? Anything that might explain this? Susan sighed. It's complicated, but I'll try. Marjorie listened as Susan explained. Elena had recently gone through a quiet crisis of her own. A failed relationship, the end of a contract job overseas, a return home that felt more like a retreat than a return. She had reached out to Clara not long after her move, seeking familiarity. According to Susan, they had grown close again very quickly. Long video calls, exchanges of old photos, talks about identity, about the strange feeling of aging into a self you no longer recognized. Elena said something to me, Susan added. She said, what if I could help someone else find their way back, even if I haven't found mine yet? I didn't know what she meant at the time. Marjorie nodded slowly. Clara left behind her phone, her routine, everything. But Elena carried her bag onto a flight. To Paris. Susan was quiet. I don't think she ever intended to stay there, Marjorie added. It was a decoy, something to keep Kevin distracted, perhaps. That sounds like something they planned together, Susan said, her voice warming with a note of admiration. Those two used to build whole worlds in their bedrooms, create scripts, swap names. They didn't just play, they became the roles. But this isn't a game, Marjorie said gently. No, but maybe it's a form of healing. After they said goodbye, Marjorie sat back in her chair. The pieces were fitting now, not into a single clean story, but into something more layered. Clara had orchestrated a temporary vanishing act. With Elena's help, not out of fear or recklessness, but as an act of rediscovery. And Elena, despite her own unsettled state, had agreed to step into the illusion, perhaps because she, too, was seeking meaning. That evening, as the sky faded into indigo, Marjorie received a call from an unknown number. She answered with calm anticipation. "Hi," came the voice, soft, familiar. "Clara," Marjorie said without question. "Yes." A pause stretched between them, deep but not awkward. "I was going to call sooner," Clara said, "but I wasn't ready." "You don't owe me an apology," Marjorie said. "Only the truth." There was another pause. "I'm not lost," Clara said. "I didn't run away. I just stepped out. Elena helped me carve out a small corner of stillness, somewhere I could listen to myself without all the noise." Marjorie's voice stayed steady. "You could have told me. I thought I would, but when the moment came, I chose not to. Not because I didn't trust you, but because I didn't trust myself to explain it well. I thought if I started explaining, I might talk myself out of doing it all." Marjorie nodded. "So this is about finding something you feel you've lost?" "No," Clara said. "It's about remembering something I buried." I kept pushing her away. The younger me, the one who used to paint, write, wander. I've spent years being good, efficient, reliable, but I forgot how to be curious, how to be undefined. Is Elena helping? She's been a mirror, a witness. And yes, she's been herself, too. Still full of chaos and warmth. Still reckless. But she understands me in a way no one else does. She remembers the old me, not just the version I perform now. Marjorie closed her eyes. "I'll be back soon," Clara said. "A few more days, maybe a week." "I'll be here," Marjorie replied, "when you're ready." They didn't say goodbye. The call ended quietly, naturally, as if words were no longer needed. Marjorie returned to the living room, sat in the armchair by the window, and watched as the moonlight painted soft shapes across the floorboards. There were no more secrets, only spaces where truth had been waiting patiently to emerge. Kevin Langford had never been good at sitting still, especially not on overnight flights, where sleep came in shallow fits, interrupted by intercom announcements and the occasional turbulence. But this flight had been different, not because of the altitude, but because of what he had seen before boarding. The image of Clara walking past him, silent and composed, her scarf tucked into the collar of her coat, had embedded itself deep into his mind like a glitch in reality. He had not doubted it was her, not for a second. Now, as he sat in his Paris hotel room, the silence felt heavier than jet lag. His calls to Clara's phone had gone unanswered, and the photo he'd snapped, discreetly uncertainly, of the woman boarding the plane stared back at him from his screen. The resemblance was uncanny. He had even zoomed in on her sunglasses, hoping for some hidden clue in the reflection. Kevin's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. He crossed the room and opened it. The woman standing there was the same one he had seen at the airport. The scarf, the hair, the posture. It was Clara in every physical sense. But the moment she removed her sunglasses, the illusion shattered. "Elena," Kevin said, stepping back in disbelief. She smiled awkwardly. "Hi, I figured you'd be staying here." "You?" He hesitated, unsure where to begin. "You took Clara's seat. You let me believe." "I didn't let you believe anything," she said, stepping inside. "I just didn't correct what you assumed. And yes, I know that was wrong." Kevin shut the door behind her. The air between them was charged, not with anger exactly, but confusion tangled with disappointment. "Why?" he asked, folding his arms. "Why go through all this?" Elena sighed. "Because Clara asked me to. She needed space. Time. She needed to get out from under everything." "From me?" he asked quietly. Elena looked up. "From herself, Kevin. You just happened to be part of the framework she needed to step away from." He sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. "And Paris? That was a decoy." "Yes. And no. It gave her room to breathe without anyone rushing after her. She knew if you thought she'd left the country, you'd hesitate to follow." Kevin rubbed his forehead. "God, this is insane." Elena sat in the chair across from him, folding her hands in her lap. "I stayed the night in your seat, used her boarding pass, took her bag. The airline never noticed. Clara had already talked to them. She told them she'd be switching with a cousin for check-in due to a scheduling mix-up. That's all they needed. You went through with it that easily?" "I owed her," Elena said simply. "She helped me when I hit rock bottom, when I had no idea what to do next. This was something I could do for her." Kevin leaned back against the headboard, his mind reeling. "You don't even sound sorry." "I'm not sure I am," she said. "It worked. She's safe, and she's thinking clearly for the first time in years. Isn't that what you want?" "I want my wife," he said. "The real one. Not tricks. Not silence." "She'll come back," Elena said gently. "But she wants to come back as herself. Not the version she thinks you built your life around." Kevin stared at her. "What version is that?" Elena didn't answer directly. Instead, she pulled something from her bag, a postcard, slightly creased with a watercolor print of wildflowers. She handed it to him. On the back, in Clara's handwriting, was a single sentence. "Don't wait for me to be the same. Wait for me to be whole." Kevin read the line again and again. "She's in Fairhill," Elena said, "at a place called Whistling Pines. She didn't want you to know yet, but I think maybe now she's ready." Kevin looked up slowly. "Are you sure?" "She left this," Elena replied, pulling out a second note, folded neatly, "to give you when I thought the time was right." He unfolded the page. "Clara's writing again. If you're reading this, then it means I trust you to meet me where I am, not where I was. I'm still me, Kevin, but for the first time in years, I'm remembering how to carry myself, without mirrors, without performance. I miss you. I love you, but I need you to see me when I'm not trying to impress you." He sat in silence, reading the note twice more. The tightness in his chest began to loosen, though it didn't disappear. "Thank you," he said quietly. Elena stood. "I'll be checking out, going back to my own life, or at least trying to figure out what that looks like now." She paused at the door. "Kevin, don't take this the wrong way, but sometimes the people who seem happiest in a relationship are the ones who've quietly gone missing in it." He said nothing. She left the room without another word. The next morning, Kevin boarded a flight back to Philadelphia. The airport felt different this time, less like a place of departure and more like a place of choice. He rented a car at the terminal and drove in silence down winding roads, past small towns and into the wooded paths near Fairhill. Signs for Whistling Pines appeared with increasing frequency, painted in calm fonts on wooden boards. When he arrived, the receptionist at the lodge greeted him with a knowing smile. "Mr. Langford?" "Yes," he said. "Clara's husband. She said you might come. She's in cabin 4, just up the hill past the clearing." He nodded and walked slowly, the gravel crunching beneath his shoes. As he approached the cabin, he saw her through the window, sitting at a small desk, her hair loose around her shoulders, a pencil in hand. She looked peaceful, focused. He hesitated before knocking. She turned, meeting his eyes through the glass. And then she smiled, not wide, not performed, just real. She stood and opened the door. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said. "I wasn't sure either," he replied. "But you're here," she said. He nodded. "Yeah, I'm here." And for the first time in a long while, there was nothing else that needed to be said. Clara and Kevin stood in the doorway of the cabin for several seconds, neither rushing to break the quiet. The air smelled of pine and damp soil, and somewhere beyond the trees, A wind chime swayed gently with the breeze. It was the kind of silence that did not beg to be filled. It invited presence, not explanation. Clara stepped aside, her bare feet brushing the wooden floor as she gestured for him to come in. Kevin entered without a word. The space was small and simple, just a desk, a narrow bed, a bookshelf half filled with old paperbacks, and a kitchenette tucked neatly in the corner. Paintings, delicate watercolors, lined the walls. A few of them, Kevin noticed, looked familiar. "You've been painting," he said. Clara nodded. "Every day since I got here. Just like I used to." He glanced at her, but she had already moved to the desk. She picked up a small tin of pencils and turned it between her fingers, then set it down with quiet deliberation. "Is this what you needed?" he asked finally. Clara sat on the edge of the bed and folded her hands in her lap. "I didn't know what I needed. Not really. I just knew that the version of me everyone loved was getting harder and harder to carry. She wasn't fake, Kevin. She was just tired." He remained standing, one hand resting on the back of the chair. "I wish you had told me." "I did," she said gently. "Not in words. But I tried. I let go of things I used to care about. I stayed quiet when I should have spoken up. I started making room, hoping someone would notice." Kevin sank into the chair, his eyes tracing the grain of the wood beneath his hand. "I noticed. I just didn't understand what I was seeing." "I didn't either," she said. "Not until Elena came back." Kevin looked up at that. "So she really just showed up and offered to, what, be you for a while?" Clara smiled faintly. "Not exactly. We've been talking for months. She was going through something too, and in the middle of all that mess, we started remembering who we used to be, not just to each other, but to ourselves." He tilted his head. "And the idea to switch?" "It started as a joke," Clara said. "What if I could disappear for a few days and no one would even notice? What if you mistook her for me?" We laughed about it at first, but then I couldn't stop thinking about it. How easy it might be. Kevin's expression tightened. "And it was easy. That's what scares me." Clara's voice dropped. "I didn't do it to scare you. I did it because I needed to break the rhythm, just for a few days, so I could remember what it felt like to choose something for myself." He nodded slowly, letting her words settle between them. She stood and walked to the window. "Elena didn't just help me disappear. She helped me see what I had disappeared into. She saw me clearly, without the roles, the expectations. It reminded me of a version of myself I had forgotten." Kevin rose, stepping closer but not touching her. "And what about me? Did I fit into that version?" Clara turned. Her eyes held a softness that hadn't been there the last time he saw her. "You've always been part of me, Kevin. But somewhere along the way, I stopped showing you the full picture. Not because I didn't trust you, but because I stopped trusting that the full picture was worth seeing." He looked down, his jaw tightening. "That's not fair." "I know," she said, "but it's the truth." He sat again, the edge of frustration flickering across his face. "You left without telling me. You sent your cousin to take your place on an international flight. You left your phone, your bag, your routine. You made it look like you'd vanished." "I left signs," she said. "Not because I wanted you to panic, but because I wanted you to pause, to think about who I might be if I wasn't following the script." He let out a long breath. "You could have just told me. You didn't need to create a whole performance." She gave him a sad smile. "But if I had told you, would you have let me go?" He didn't answer, and they both knew the truth. They spent the rest of the morning in that cabin, not unraveling the entire story, but laying it gently between them. Clara showed him her sketches. Portraits of women with no faces, only outlines, surrounded by bursts of color and shade. She read aloud a few pages from a notebook she'd been keeping, reflections more like fragments than full thoughts. He listened, not always knowing what to say, but staying present. At one point, he asked, "Did you ever plan to go to Paris?" She shook her head. "It was Elena's idea. The perfect red herring. You saw her and assumed. It gave me space. You could have called me when you got here." "I could have," she agreed, "but I needed silence first. And trust me, I'm not great at silence." Kevin smiled for the first time that day. "You're not." She laughed lightly, then turned serious again. I didn't want to hurt you. I just wanted to find myself somewhere without being watched for how I was doing it. You don't need permission for that, he said. I know, she replied, but I needed courage. They stepped outside in the afternoon, walking down the gravel path toward the communal garden. A few other guests passed by with nods and small smiles. Clara waved at the groundskeeper, who tipped his cap in return. Kevin watched her interact, noting how different she seemed. Not unrecognizable, but fuller, as though more of her had returned to the surface. They sat on a bench beneath a tall cedar tree. Bees hovered over late summer blooms. The breeze was gentle but cool. Do you still want to come home? Kevin asked, not out of bitterness but vulnerability. Clara looked at him, her expression calm. Yes, but not in the same way. He nodded. Then we'll do it differently. Will we? She asked, voice quiet. He reached over and took her hand. We'll try. They stayed like that for a while, holding hands in the shade of the cedar, surrounded by strangers, no longer pretending. When they returned to the cabin, Clara handed him a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. What's this? A letter, she said, for your mother. I haven't been brave enough to call her. Kevin raised an eyebrow. She already knows everything. Clara blinked. She does? He nodded. She figured it out before I did. She's been patient. Clara smiled. Of course she has. That night, Kevin didn't stay at the cabin. He returned to a nearby inn, giving Clara her space. They promised to meet in the morning, to talk more, to begin sketching out what came next. As she watched him walk away, Clara felt no guilt, no panic, only a quiet sense of return, not to a version of herself that had been buried, but to the woman who had finally chosen to listen to her own voice, even if it had taken distance, deception, and her cousin's help to hear it again. And for the first time in a long while, she was curious about her future. Not anxious, not afraid, curious. Late that night, in a modest hotel room overlooking a narrow street in central Paris, Elena sat at the small desk by the window, her phone pressed to her ear, her eyes fixed on the twinkling lights of a city that had always promised more than it ever gave. She had never liked Paris. Too perfect, too polished, too cinematic to feel real. And yet, here she was, waiting for a voice to answer on the other end of the line. It had taken her most of the day to decide to make the call. Clara had asked her not to reach out unless absolutely necessary. But after seeing Kevin's face at the airport, after walking past him without a word, Elena had realized something. There was no more use in silence. The truth, no matter how delicate or well-intentioned, was already spilling out into the open. The line clicked. Marjorie Langford. Came the voice on the other end, calm but alert. Elena smiled faintly. Hi, Marjorie. It's Elena. A pause. I thought you might call, Marjorie said. I imagine you pieced most of it together by now. I have, but there's always more to the story than the clues suggest. Elena nodded to herself. Then maybe it's time I filled in the rest. She took a deep breath. It started months ago. Clara and I reconnected after years of barely speaking. At first, it was innocent. Memories, catch-ups, old jokes. But then the conversations turned heavier. She told me how she felt, eroded, like each version of herself had slowly been worn down to something smooth and unrecognizable. She didn't say she was unhappy. She said she was blurred. Marjorie said nothing, just listened. She wanted space. Elena continued. A real break, but not to run away. She wanted to observe herself from the outside, to feel how the world moved without her shaping it. And I was a mirror. We always joke we look alike, but the truth is, we were more than mirrors. We were reflections of what the other had once chosen not to become. And what had you become? Marjorie asked softly. A woman with too many exit strategies, Elena replied. Always chasing the next version of myself before the current one could fall apart. Clara saw that in me. She envied my chaos. I envied her stability. So we traded for a moment. Marjorie's voice was measured. And did it help her? Elena hesitated. Yes, I think it did. But it shook her, too. Sometimes freedom doesn't feel like wings. It feels like vertigo. She's facing herself now, without costume. It's terrifying, but it's also real. A soft sigh came through the line. You know, I kept wondering why she didn't just talk to Kevin. Or to me. But now I see this wasn't about avoiding us. It was about facing herself. Exactly, Elena said. She trusted you to figure it out, and she trusted Kevin to meet her on the other side. Elena, Marjorie asked, was it your idea to go to Paris? Elena smiled faintly. No, it was Clara's. She thought if she sent me far enough, no one would look nearby. She bought the ticket, gave me her bag, and told me to keep quiet. I was to disappear long enough for her to become visible again to herself. And now, Marjorie asked, I'm flying home tomorrow, Elena said. She doesn't need me anymore. She's found her voice again. There was a long pause, and then Marjorie said, You did something reckless, but it wasn't careless. Thank you for watching over her. I owed her, Elena replied. She reminded me that running isn't the same as choosing. I've spent most of my life confusing the two. When the call ended, Elena sat in silence for a long time, letting the weight of it settle over her. She had always believed herself to be the one who lived without anchors. But something about this trip had changed that. Clara had given her not just a mission, but a mirror, and Elena had finally looked into it without flinching. Back in Pennsylvania, Marjorie placed the phone back in its cradle and looked out the window, where the night sky had cleared. A few stars blinked faintly above the treetops, and the wind carried the scent of rain-soaked earth. She walked to her study and opened Clara's notebook again, flipping to a page she hadn't read before. I don't want to be rescued. I want to be remembered. Not as a wife, not as a daughter-in-law, not as someone something. I want to be remembered as a person who once took a risk to meet herself in the quiet and chose to stay for the conversation. Marjorie smiled. There was a quiet courage in that. The next morning, Kevin called his mother from the small cafe near the retreat. He spoke slowly, but his voice was lighter. She's coming back soon, he said. I know, Marjorie replied. She wants to change some things. She should, Marjorie said. And so should you. I'm trying. She's not asking you to be someone else, Kevin. She's asking you to see her clearly. He was quiet for a moment. And if I don't recognize who she becomes, then you look harder, Marjorie said. Because people aren't made to stay still, especially not the ones worth holding on to. Kevin breathed deeply. She wrote me a letter, told me she wants to come home, but not the way she left. That's a start, Marjorie said. Clara spent one more full day at the retreat before she began packing her things. She wrapped her brushes in a cloth sleeve, folded her sketchbooks into her satchel, and tucked the final note to herself into the front pocket of her coat. It read, You are not a role. You are a rhythm. At sunrise the following morning, she stepped outside with her bag slung over her shoulder. Kevin waited by the gate, leaning against the hood of the rental car. He looked up when he heard her footsteps. Ready? He asked. Clara nodded. As I'll ever be. They didn't rush the drive back. They took the scenic route, winding through golden fields and sleepy towns. At one point, they stopped at a roadside stand and bought fresh apples. At another, they shared a brief laugh over a billboard that faded into near illegibility. It was quiet between them, but not the tense kind of quiet that had once defined the distance in their home. This quiet felt lived in, like a pause between two chapters of the same story. When they reached the house, Marjorie stood on the porch, arms folded loosely, watching them with calm eyes. Clara stepped out of the car first. Marjorie met her halfway and embraced her, not tightly, not tearfully, but with a firmness that said, I'm still here. I kept your garden alive, Marjorie said softly. I never doubted you would, Clara replied. They walked inside together, leaving the door open behind them. For the first time in weeks, the house felt whole, and no one had to pretend to be anyone else. Clara woke the next morning in her own bed, the familiar weight of her old quilt pressed lightly against her legs. Morning sunlight spilled through the sheer curtains of the guest room at Marjorie's house, casting long, golden slivers across the hardwood floor. For a moment, she didn't move. She listened to the quiet murmur of birds outside, to the creak of the old radiator heating the room, to her own breath settling into the rhythm of home. Kevin had gone back to their house the night before, giving her space to readjust. Marjorie had insisted Clara stay one more night under her roof, just until things felt steady again. And Clara had agreed, not out of fear, but gratitude. There had been no interrogation, no expectation of explanations, only space. And in that space, Clara had begun to feel the first hints of something she hadn't expected: readiness. After breakfast, a quiet, warm affair with eggs, toast, and a small bowl of blackberries, Clara stood by the sink washing dishes while Marjorie dried them. Their movements, practiced over years of holiday meals and family visits, required no words. "I got a message from Elena this morning," Marjorie said softly, folding a dish towel. "She landed safely. She's staying with Susan for now." Clara nodded, her eyes still on the soapy water. "She told me she would leave as soon as she knew I was staying." Marjorie glanced at her. "Did you need her to leave so you could return?" "No," Clara said, "but I needed her to go back to her own story. I was starting to confuse hers with mine." Marjorie placed the last dish in a rack and leaned against the counter. "You both did something risky." Clara met her eyes. "I know. And it worked." Clara smiled faintly. Not perfectly, but enough. Later that morning, she returned to her own house. It felt smaller than she remembered, not physically, but in the way spaces do when they've been lived in only partially. Kevin had kept things in order. The floors were swept, the mail sorted, even the indoor plants watered. Still, there was an absence in the air, the lingering afterimage of someone who had disappeared without closing the door behind her. She placed her bag down in the hallway and stepped into the living room. Her eyes scanned the shelves, the framed photos, the books she once loved and then abandoned for time's sake. She moved slowly, reacquainting herself with what had once felt ordinary. Kevin arrived a few minutes later. He didn't knock. He let himself in and walked to where she stood, at the edge of the room near the window. "I wasn't sure if you wanted me to come back so soon," he said. "I do," Clara said, "but only if we're ready to talk about what comes next." He stepped closer, but didn't sit. "I've been thinking about that since the retreat, about how much of our life was built on unspoken agreements." She turned toward him. "Like which ones?" "Like how you always took care of the plans. How I assumed you'd be okay with whatever I needed. How we both started performing the idea of being fine." Clara didn't answer immediately. She walked to the sofa and sat down, motioning for him to join her. When he did, she turned slightly, folding her legs beneath her. "I've spent years editing myself," she said, "trimming the parts that didn't seem useful or comfortable. I don't blame you for that. I don't even fully blame me. It's something we both did. We kept things easy, predictable, but not necessarily true." Kevin rubbed his hands together. "I've been trying to find the moment it started, when we stopped noticing each other." Clara shook her head. "It's not one moment. It's a series of them. Small ones, like brushing aside a comment, letting a silence stretch too long, choosing not to ask why someone seems distant because you're afraid of the answer. So how do we change that?" he asked. "First," Clara said, "we have to stop assuming what the other person needs. We ask, we listen, we stop fixing. And after that, we forgive ourselves for the versions of us that didn't know better." Kevin exhaled. "I can do that. Or try." "There's one more thing," Clara added, reaching into her coat pocket. She pulled out a small envelope. "Elena gave me your copy of this, but I wanted to hand you mine." He took it, turning it over in his hands before opening it. Inside was a simple letter, handwritten on the stationery Clara had used at the retreat. "This is not a confession. It's a commitment to speak without disguise, to listen without defense, to live without pretending." Kevin looked up. "You wrote this for me?" "I wrote it for us to carry forward. If we're going to build something new, it needs to start with this." He nodded slowly, folding the letter back into the envelope. "Then let's start." The next few days were quiet. They didn't rush back into old routines. Clara returned to work part-time, but carved out hours each week to paint and write. Kevin reduced his travel schedule for the first time in years. They didn't make any dramatic declarations. Instead, they made small adjustments, a new rhythm forming between them, unfamiliar but honest. One evening, while sorting through the storage closet, Clara came across the carry-on bag that Elena had used for the Paris trip. She hadn't touched it since returning. She unzipped the front pouch and found a note tucked inside, folded into thirds. I never intended to become you. I only wanted to hold space until you were ready to return. You owe me nothing, but thank you for trusting me with your shadow. Elena. Beneath the note was a photo of the two of them from years ago, both dressed in Halloween costumes. One a pirate, the other a magician. They were laughing, arms wrapped around each other. The image had always been one of Clara's favorites. She placed a photo on her nightstand. A week later, Clara mailed a small package to Elena. Inside were two things: a painting she'd done at the retreat of two silhouetted figures walking side by side, and a card with just 5 words written on the inside. You reminded me to return. Life didn't revert to what it had been before. That was never the goal. Instead, it shifted. It deepened. Clara no longer filled every silence with usefulness. Kevin no longer assumed presence meant peace. Marjorie visited more often, not to check in but to participate. And though the story of Clara's disappearance was never shared widely, those who needed to know knew, and they understood. Making it right wasn't about erasing what had happened. It was about accepting it, learning from it, and growing forward with intention. And in the quiet that followed, there was room for something new to grow. Autumn came early that year. By mid-September, the maples in Marjorie's yard had begun to blush into copper and gold, shedding their first dry leaves onto the lawn. Clara stood at the edge of the porch one morning, sipping warm cider from a ceramic mug, wrapped in the thick woolen shawl Marjorie had once knitted during a long, cold winter. The house behind her buzzed with quiet energy. Kevin was inside with Marjorie, prepping for the small dinner they had planned that evening. It wasn't a celebration, not officially. There was no cake, no decorations, no particular occasion. But the night held meaning all the same. Clara had decided, after much thought and careful hesitation, that it was time to share what had happened with those who mattered most. They had invited just a few people: Julia, Clara's closest friend, Susan and Elena, who had returned briefly to Pennsylvania for a family visit, and Marjorie's neighbor, Ruth, who had always offered calm companionship over the years. It was a modest gathering, but for Clara, it was the most vulnerable audience she could imagine. She hadn't written a speech. She hadn't rehearsed anything. She only knew that if her life was truly going to continue along a more truthful path, then this was a step she couldn't avoid. By early evening, the kitchen was full of warm scents: baked squash, roasted chicken, honey-glazed carrots. The dining table had been extended and dressed in a linen cloth, small votive candles flickering along the center. Everyone arrived casually, coats draped over arms, cheeks pink from the crisp weather, voices low and respectful, without being somber. Clara greeted Elena last. The hug between them was longer than necessary, but neither woman let go quickly. It had only been a few weeks, but everything between them had changed. "I'm glad you came," Clara said. "I wouldn't have missed it," Elena replied. "You're the one who brought me back to myself. I needed to see what that looks like when someone follows through." They sat near the center of the table, across from Kevin and Marjorie. Julia took the seat next to Clara, as she always had, offering a wink before sipping her wine. Dinner passed with the usual pleasantries, catching up, teasing, reminiscing. Clara noticed how the laughter sounded different now. Not forced, not performative, just present. And then, when the dishes had been cleared and dessert waited quietly on the counter, she stood from her chair. "I want to say something," she said, voice clear but calm. The room quieted. Even Ruth set her napkin aside with delicate precision. Clara rested her hands on the back of her chair. "I haven't told everyone here what really happened a few weeks ago. Some of you know parts of it. Some of you know more than others. But tonight, I want to tell the story, not because I need to explain myself, but because I want to share what came out of it." A pause. "I left," she said. "Not forever. But suddenly, quietly, I disappeared in a way that was Designed. Kevin, you saw Elaine at the airport. That wasn't a mistake. It was a distraction, one I asked her to make. All eyes shifted to Elena, who met their gaze without apology. I needed to step out of my life, Clara continued. Not because I didn't love it or love the people in it, but because I had begun to forget who I was without the roles I played inside it. The wife, the daughter-in-law, the friend, even the version of myself I showed to Julia sometimes felt edited. Julia reached out and touched Clara's wrist gently. I went to a retreat, Clara said. Not in Europe, not anywhere glamorous, just a quiet place not far from here. I took nothing but a few notebooks and some pencils. I didn't tell anyone where I was going because if I did, I don't think I would have gone. Kevin nodded slowly. I painted. I walked. I wrote things I never planned to read again. And I remembered something simple. I used to be someone else. Not better, not braver, but more whole. And I missed her. She glanced around the table. Elena helped me create the illusion. She took my bag, wore my scarf, stepped into a role. I asked her to perform, not to deceive anyone out of cruelty, but to hold a space that allowed me to step outside of myself. I don't regret asking her, and I hope none of you will judge her for helping me. No one's judging, Susan said softly. Clara exhaled. Good, because what came out of that silence, what came out of the stillness, wasn't shame. It was clarity. Marjorie stood then, surprising everyone. What Clara's saying, what she's done, takes more courage than I've seen in a long time. We talk a lot about reinvention, especially when we're younger. But reinvention in the middle of a life, in the middle of a marriage, in the middle of knowing who you're supposed to be, that's something different. That's risk with consequences. Everyone listened, no one interrupting. I've known Clara since Kevin first brought her home, Marjorie said. She's always been thoughtful, kind, reliable. But I think she's finally becoming something more important, honest. With herself first, and now with us. Clara sat back down. The silence that followed was full, not awkward. It was a kind of quiet that falls over people who are witnessing something delicate and rare. Elena spoke next. I didn't plan to become a version of Clara. I didn't even like the idea at first. But when she asked me to do it, I saw something in her that I hadn't seen in years. Hope. And I think we're allowed to help the people we love, even if it's unconventional. Susan smiled at her daughter, proud but cautious. Just as long as you don't make a habit of boarding planes under false identities. Laughter broke the tension, and someone poured more wine. Plates were passed around. Slowly, the room returned to the rhythm of warmth. Later, as dessert was served, Julia leaned close to Clara. I always knew there was more in you than you let on, she said. You just needed a moment to meet it. I'm still meeting it, Clara replied, but I'm not afraid anymore. When the evening wound down and the guests began to say their goodbyes, Marjorie walked with Clara to the front porch. The night had grown colder, the stars crisp and clear above the silhouette of the trees. You did what many wouldn't dare, Marjorie said. You invited people into your truth. I wasn't sure I'd be able to. And now, Clara looked out across the yard. Now I feel like I've only just begun. You know, Marjorie said, you could write about it, not just for you, but for others. There's something here. Clara considered the idea. Maybe, but first, I think I just want to live a little longer. Marjorie nodded. That's a good place to start. Inside, Kevin had started cleaning up. Clara joined him, and they worked side by side, rinsing dishes, drying plates, moving without friction. At one point, their hands brushed against each other over a shared towel. Clara didn't pull away. She held his gaze. Thank you, she said. For what? For staying. He touched her cheek. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm with the real you, and I'm not going anywhere. They finished the dishes in silence, not out of distance, but trust. And outside, the stars kept their quiet vigil. A few days after the dinner, the air grew noticeably cooler. Morning light filtered to the tall windows of Clara and Kevin's living room with a softness that felt deliberate, as if the world itself were giving them time to adjust, to breathe. It had been 2 weeks since Clara returned from the retreat, and while life had begun to settle into a new rhythm, there remained unfinished threads, small things that needed attention not out of urgency, but out of care. That morning, Clara opened her closet in search of a scarf and found the smaller of her travel bags, the one Elena had carried on the flight to Paris. She hadn't touched it since arriving home. Something about it had made her hesitate. It had been filled and zipped by someone else, used in a version of her life she hadn't occupied. But now, with a gentle sense of closure settling over the edges of her mind, she knelt before it and opened the main compartment. Most of what was inside had already been returned. Her passport, her lip balm, a half-read paperback. But in the side pocket, she found something she didn't expect. A pale blue envelope with her name written on the front in Elena's handwriting. It was tucked inside a small linen pouch, alongside a folded photograph. She placed the pouch on the bed and opened the envelope carefully. "Clara, you gave me something I didn't realize I needed, the chance to matter again, not as a substitute, but as a reflection of something once shared. When we were kids, we played dress-up like it was a secret language. What we didn't know then was that those games were practice, for reinvention, for bravery, for stepping out of line when the past stopped fitting. I didn't get to say goodbye the way I wanted, but maybe this is better. In your bag, I left something I've carried too long. I think it's time you had it. I'll find my own retreat someday. Love, E." Clara unfolded the photo. It was a black and white image, aged slightly at the corners. 2 girls sat on the front steps of a childhood home, one with a toy sword in her hand, the other with a paper crown. They were both barefoot, both laughing. Clara recognized the scene instantly. They must have been 10, maybe 11. The photo had once been pinned to corkboard in their shared summer bedroom, but had disappeared years ago. The note Elena had added to the back was simple. "This is who we were before we became who they expected." Clara sat on the edge of the bed and held the photo in both hands. Her throat tightened, not from sadness, but from the strange, quiet ache that comes with remembering something that once belonged to you and only now feels returned. Later that afternoon, she found herself drawn to the old art studio she and Kevin had converted into a guest room years ago. The easel still stood in the corner, though it had collected a thin film of dust. Clara opened the small cabinet beneath the window and found her old acrylics, still sealed, still usable. She hadn't painted since the retreat. She'd sketched, dabbled, tested herself. But now, she felt the need to create something not from memory, but from understanding. She started with simple shapes. A hillside, a path, 2 small figures, walking away from the viewer, hand in hand. The lines were soft, the brush strokes delicate. It was not a masterpiece, but it was true. When Kevin came home that evening, he found her still in the studio, sleeves rolled up, a smudge of green on her cheek. "That's new," he said, nodding toward the canvas. Clara turned and smiled. "It's not for anyone, just for me. Those are the best ones." She reached for a cloth and began wiping her fingers clean. "I found a photo Elena left, the one from our backyard. It reminded me of how much of our lives stars pretend until we're brave enough to make it real." Kevin stepped closer, gently brushing the green paint from her cheek with his thumb. "And is it real now?" She looked into his eyes, steady and unguarded, more than it's ever been. He kissed her forehead, then reached for her hand. "Dinner's almost ready. I made that risotto you like. It's probably too salty, but I tried." She laughed, linking her fingers with his. "Then I'll bring the wine." That night, they ate on the patio under a sky streaked with late September stars. They spoke little, letting the quiet fill the space between them. Clara felt the difference, not in the words they shared, but in what no longer needed to be hidden. Afterward, as they cleared the plates, Kevin pulled a small box from his coat pocket. "I wasn't sure when the right time would be," he said. Clara raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "You're not proposing again, are you?" He laughed. "No, nothing like that." Inside the box was a silver chain with a tiny charm, a compass. Simple, elegant. "For the next time you get lost," he said, "or the next time you choose to be." Clara ran her thumb over the charm. You're not afraid I'll disappear again? He met her gaze. Not if I know how to find you. She placed a necklace around her neck, fastening the clasp with steady fingers. It rested just below her collarbone. That night, in the quiet of their bedroom, she wrote a letter to Elena. She didn't know when it would be sent. Maybe tomorrow, maybe next month. But the words came easily. Elena, I wore the crown. You carried the sword. And somehow, both of us became stronger than either role ever allowed. Thank you for holding the space I couldn't hold for myself. I hope you find your place. Not the one they told you to find, but the one that sings when you step into it. Clara placed a letter in an envelope and set it on her desk. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, scattering leaves across the lawn. And in that quiet, where no one was missing and nothing was being hidden, warmth returned, not just to the house, but to the parts of herself Clara had once left behind. October brought with it clarity that no season before it had managed to offer. The air was brisk but not bitter. The sky, often cloudless, stretched wide and blue above the town, as if the world itself had taken a long breath and settled into stillness. In the weeks following her return, Clara found herself walking more, not quickly, not to get anywhere, but simply to exist in the motion. She walked past the familiar streets near Marjorie's house, past a bakery where Kevin used to buy her favorite croissants on Saturdays, past a bookstore with the crooked windows and soft-spoken owner who never forgot her name. She walked to remember that she still belonged, to herself, to this place, to the lives that had folded around her without consuming her. But it was not just about Clara anymore. The effects of her departure, her return, and everything in between had stirred quiet change in the people around her. In Kevin, certainly. In Marjorie. Even in Elena, though she now lived elsewhere again. And through those shifts, something deeper had begun to root itself. A redefinition of what family meant. Not just in structure, but in essence. It began with a call. Marjorie rang one afternoon with a simple question. Would you host this year? Clara blinked. Thanksgiving? Yes. Here's the thing. Everyone's waiting for someone else to make the plan. But I think it should be you. Not because it's your turn. Because it's your home. And I think we all need to be reminded of what that means. Clara hesitated, glancing around the room. The walls were still adorned with art and books, but something had shifted in the energy of the space. It no longer felt like a gallery of expectations. It felt lived in again. I'd love to, she said. The days that followed became a gentle hum of preparation. Clara didn't try to outdo herself. She didn't obsess over perfection. She simply opened her doors and her calendar and allowed each small task to become a gesture of reconnection. On the morning of the gathering, she stood at the kitchen counter slicing apples for a tart, while Kevin arranged chairs in the dining room. There was music playing, instrumental, calm. Marjorie arrived early, carrying her signature cranberry chutney and a half-finished scarf she'd been knitting for Ruth. Clara and she worked side by side, as if no rupture had ever taken place between them, as if all the distance had only deepened their mutual care. Elena arrived mid-afternoon, a few hours before dinner. She came through the back entrance, her suitcase already lightened by a week spent with her mother in town. I brought wine, she said, holding up a bottle. Clara smiled. I was afraid you'd bring another story disguised as a gift. This time, Elena replied, I brought both separately. They hugged, more firmly than before, more freely. The table filled as the sun began to drop. Julia came with her partner. Susan brought homemade rolls, and even Ruth made an appearance, wrapped in a shawl and holding a lemon pie she'd baked that morning. It was not a large group, but it was whole. Dinner unfolded in waves, laughter, small talk, quiet moments, memories shared without bitterness. When someone brought up travel, Kevin leaned back and said, The best trip I took this year was 20 minutes outside of town. Everyone understood what he meant. No one needed it explained. Midway through the evening, Clara stood and tapped her glass lightly. The room fell into an easy hush. I won't make a speech, she said, but I want to say this. She glanced around the table. I used to think family was something you protected at all costs. That harmony meant silence. That love meant being good at disappearing into the needs of others. But I was wrong, or at least incomplete. She paused. Family is not what we hold together by force. It's what we make space for. Space to change, to question, to return, and to be accepted, not just in spite of that, but because of it. Marjorie raised her glass first. To returning. Elena followed, and to space. To all of it, Kevin said. The clinking of glasses echoed softly in the room, gentle and sincere. Later that evening, when most of the guests had gone and only a few remained lingering over second helpings and old photographs, Clara stepped onto the back porch for air. Marjorie joined her moments later, carrying 2 mugs of spiced tea. You did well tonight, she said, handing Clara one. I didn't feel like I had to prove anything, Clara said. That's what made it perfect. They watched the wind play through the leaves for a while. Then Marjorie turned to her. You know, she said, families don't often talk about what happens in the in-between, the chapters that aren't framed in holiday cards or photo albums. But I think those are the chapters that hold everything together. Clara nodded. The ones no one sees. Exactly, Marjorie said. But I saw you. Even when you disappeared, I still saw you, and I'm proud of who came back. Clara placed her hand gently on Marjorie's. You never left either, she said. That night, after the final guest had departed, Clara and Kevin stood together in the kitchen, stacking dishes and replaying small moments from the evening. She's staying with your mom until Sunday, Kevin said, referring to Elena. I think she's planning to visit the coast after that. Maybe Oregon. She's always chasing something, Clara said with a smile. She said something interesting before she left, Kevin added. Said the bravest thing she saw all year wasn't a retreat. It was what came after, when you chose to stay, when you chose to build something with no script. Clara considered that. Maybe we all needed to stop rehearsing. He took her hand. Then, let's not start again. They stood like that for a moment, grounded in the warmth of a house that had stopped holding its breath. There was no more pretending, no more performance, only presence. In the days that followed, life didn't return to normal. It created a new normal, one built on slower mornings, intentional choices, and conversations that stretched beyond logistics. Clara wrote more, painted often. Kevin found joy in the smallness of home. Marjorie visited weekly, not to oversee, but to enjoy. And Elena, even from a distance, remained part of the rhythm, sending postcards that said more in a sentence than most people could in paragraphs. One of them arrived in December. It read, If I had known the truth was this kind, I would have stopped running years ago. Clara pinned it above her desk. Outside the window, the first snow had begun to fall. Soft, quiet, deliberate. Inside, the fire burned low. And for the first time in a long time, there was nothing left to chase. Only the gentle unfolding of a life newly chosen.